The tape was still rolling. That was the rule Jimi had insisted on. The tape was always rolling, because you never knew when the right accident would happen, when the feedback would fold back on itself in exactly the right way, when a mistake would reveal something truer than anything planned. It was past 3 in the morning inside Olympic Studios in London, and the control room smelled of cigarette smoke and cold coffee and the particular anxiety of a man who believed he was running out of time. Not Jimi. Jimi never seemed to run out of time inside a studio. The studio was the one place where time bent to him rather than the other way around. The man who felt like he was running out of time was Chandler, standing on the other side of the glass, watching the session clock tick forward and the budget evaporate with every passing minute. Chandler had discovered Jimi Hendrix in a small club in New York City in September 1966. He had flown home to London carrying what he genuinely believed was the most important thing he had ever touched. Not a record, not a contract, but a human being who played guitar in a way that defied any category that had previously existed. Chandler, a former bass player with the Animals, understood music the way a carpenter understands wood, practically, structurally, with deep respect for craft and an even deeper respect for not wasting materials. He had mortgaged his future on Jimi. He had sold his bass guitars, every one of them, to finance the early sessions. And he had fought managers and record executives and skeptical journalists and anyone else who stood between Jimi Hendrix and the world's ears. He had been right about all of it. Are You Experienced had not just sold records, it had recalibrated what rock music was capable of being. Axis. Bold as love had followed, more ambitious, more layered, more strange and beautiful and dangerous. And now there was supposed to be a third album, something that would complete whatever it was Jimi was building. Chandler had called it Electric Ladyland in early conversations, and the name had stuck. But nothing else had stuck. Nothing else had settled. Everything was shifting, expanding, doubling back on itself, and Chandler was beginning to understand that the album he had imagined and the album Jimi was making were not the same album at all. But the real fracture had not happened yet. The moment that would end everything, the argument, the door, the silence that followed, was still a few weeks away. Before the breaking point, there was only the widening gap between two men who had once been perfectly aligned and were now speaking what felt like different languages inside the same room. Jimi had started inviting people into the sessions. Not scheduled session musicians, not professionals booked in advance, but friends, acquaintances, people he had met that evening at a party or a club who played something and had a spark he wanted to capture. He believed that the best music happened in the presence of people who were genuinely present, genuinely curious, genuinely without agenda. And he wanted the studio to feel alive the way a room feels alive when the right combination of people are in it, unpredictable, breathing, on the edge of something. Chandler understood this instinct intellectually, but watching it in practice was another thing entirely. A session that was supposed to run from 8 in the evening to midnight would drift past 1, past 2, past 3, musicians coming and going, ideas appearing and disappearing, the master tape filling with fragments and experiments and near misses and occasional moments of something so extraordinary it made Chandler's chest tighten. The problem was not that Jimi lacked direction. The problem was that his direction was internal, instinctive, and almost impossible to translate into a production timeline. He was chasing something that he could feel but not name, and the chase required conditions that production logic fundamentally resisted. There was one song in particular, a sprawling, multi-layered piece that Jimi had been recording and re-recording for what felt like weeks. According to accounts from musicians and engineers present during those sessions, Jimi recorded the same basic track dozens of times. Not because the previous takes were bad, some of them were extraordinary. He recorded it again because he believed the next version might reveal something the previous ones had hidden. He was excavating. He was convinced that the song contained a truth that he had not yet fully uncovered, and the only way to uncover it was to keep digging. Chandler watched take after take accumulate on the tape, listened to playbacks that seemed to him already finished, already complete, and already better than almost anything else being made in London in 1968, and felt the particular helplessness of a man who has made a significant bet on a horse that refuses to cross the finish line. He tried to explain it calmly at first. The budget had limits. The studio time had costs. Record companies had schedules. These were real constraints operating in the real world outside the studio's carefully controlled atmosphere, and they had to be respected even by artists who operated on a different plane. Jimi would listen, would nod, would seem to agree, and then the session would resume, and 4 hours later they would still be chasing the same elusive version of the same song. Another musician wandering in from the street with a tambourine or a flute, or simply the energy of someone who wanted to be in the room where it was happening. There is a version of this story that frames Chandler simply as a businessman too limited to understand what a visionary was creating. That version is not accurate and not fair. Chandler had understood what Jimi was creating before almost anyone else on Earth. He had staked his financial future on that understanding. He had fought for Jimi's artistic choices against people with far more conventional commercial instincts. The tension that was building inside those Electric Ladyland sessions was not a conflict between art and commerce in any simple sense. It was something more complicated and more painful. A conflict between two genuinely held visions of what the album should be, emerging from two men who had once shared a vision so completely that it had felt effortless. What would you sacrifice for one perfect sound? It is a question that has no clean answer, and Jimi Hendrix was living inside it every night, pushing further into an answer that Chandler could no longer follow him toward. The night the argument finally broke open, it had been building for hours. The session had started in the early evening and had extended deep into the small hours of the morning. An engineer who was present during this period later described the atmosphere in the control room as increasingly strained, Chandler quieter than usual, watching the clock with an expression that had moved past frustration into something colder and more decided. Jimi was in the live room, working through another variation, adjusting the position of a microphone by inches, listening to the playback, shaking his head slightly, going back in. He was not oblivious to the tension. People who knew Jimi well described his sensitivity to the emotional temperature of a room as almost animal. He felt shifts in mood the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. But he also believed, with the quiet certainty that defined his relationship to his own work, that the right take was close, that the next version might be the one, that stopping now would mean abandoning something that had not yet found its form. When Chandler finally spoke, it was not quiet. Accounts from that period describe a confrontation that crossed well beyond the professional disagreements that had been accumulating for weeks. The specific words that were said belong to the witnesses who were present and who have described the incident in the years since. What is clear from those accounts is that Chandler told Jimi, in terms that were not gentle, that the sessions were costing money that was being wasted, that the album needed to be finished, that what was happening in the studio every night was not making the record better. It was a release of everything that had been building. And in the particular dynamic that had existed between them, Chandler as the man who had built the conditions for Jimi's success, Jimi as the artist whose instincts had justified every risk Chandler had taken, it landed with a weight that went beyond the argument itself. Jimi did not respond with anger, at least not in the way that would have made the confrontation feel equal. Those who witnessed the exchange have described his reaction as quiet, contained, almost withdrawn. He had heard what was being said. He understood the financial reality being described. And he also understood something else, something that in that moment he either could not or chose not to explain, that what he was doing inside those sessions was not repetition born of indecision, but a genuinely different kind of creative process, one that required more time and more space and more accumulated experiment than the structure they had been working within could accommodate. The conversation ended without resolution, the way conversations end when both people recognize that the gap between their positions is not one that words can close. Chandler left. He did not leave immediately and permanently. There were a few more sessions, a few more attempts to find a working arrangement inside the growing tension. But something had broken that was not going to be repaired. Within weeks, Chaz Chandler had formally stepped away from the Electric Ladyland project. He would be replaced as producer by Jimi himself, working in collaboration with Eddie Kramer, the engineer whose technical instincts had been a constant presence through the sessions. The album would eventually be finished, though the process would continue to unfold in the only way Jimi knew how to work: by feel, by accumulation, by following the music wherever it insisted on going, regardless of the hour or the cost. But here is what most accounts of this period fail to properly examine. What Chandler lost was not just a professional relationship. He lost the closest thing he had to a creative partnership, the collaboration that had produced the most significant work of his career. And what Jimi lost, though this would only become fully visible later, was not just a manager and a producer. He lost the person who had consistently been able to translate the world's practical demands into terms that allowed Jimi to keep working, the buffer between his creative process and the machinery of the industry that surrounded it. The departure of Chaz Chandler did not immediately damage the album. Electric Ladyland, released in October 1968, was a double album of staggering ambition and achievement. Sprawling, uneven in places, excessive by conventional production standards, and containing moments of such complete originality that they still resist easy description more than 5 decades later. Jimi got his vision onto tape. But the process of getting there, and the absence of the structure that Chandler had provided, had extracted a cost that was harder to measure than a production budget. The sessions for Electric Ladyland have been described by various accounts as running to hundreds of hours of recorded material for an album that ultimately ran to just over 75 minutes. Jimi was not wasting time in any meaningful sense of that word. He was working. Every take was an exploration. Every variation revealed something. He had developed over years of playing on the Chitlin circuit and in small clubs and in the accelerated heat of the London music scene, an approach to the electric guitar that treated it as a living system rather than an instrument. Something that responded to the player's intentions, but also had its own tendencies, its own voice, its own resistance, and the best music came from the negotiation between those two things. And in the studio, he extended this negotiation into the recording process itself. The console, the tape machine, the positioning of microphones, the use of delay and reverb and feedback, all of these were not technical tools in service of capturing a pre-existing performance. They were part of the performance. They were part of the instrument. Eddie Kramer has spoken in various interviews about working with Jimi during this period, describing a musician who heard things in the playback that no one else in the room could initially identify. Tonal relationships between guitar parts, slight rhythmic displacements between tracks, the way a particular reverb setting altered the emotional quality of a phrase. Jimi would listen to a take that everyone else in the room considered finished and shake his head almost imperceptibly, because he could hear the distance between what was on the tape and what the song was trying to become. This was not perfectionism in the sense of anxiety or self-doubt. It was something closer to precision. The precision of someone who could hear the target clearly and would keep moving toward it until the shot landed. Chandler's production approach, which had served the first 2 albums so well, was built on a different but equally valid conviction, that the energy of a first or second take, captured cleanly and quickly, often contained something that extended sessions slowly erased. He had learned this from his years as a working musician, from watching great performances happen in the moment and disappear when chased too deliberately. The classic soul and rhythm and blues recordings he admired, many of them made quickly, with minimal equipment, by musicians who knew what they were doing and did it without overthinking, had a life that he believed came directly from that immediacy. He was not wrong. He was applying a real insight to a situation where Jimi's creative logic required something different. The tragedy of the split, if that word fits, is that both men were right inside their own frameworks and neither framework was wrong. The music that Chandler's approach had produced, the taut, electric first album, the layered ambition of Axis, bold as love, was extraordinary. The music that Jimi's unmediated process produced on Electric Ladyland was also extraordinary, in different ways and at different costs. What was lost was not the music. What was lost was the creative relationship itself, the specific friction and trust between two people who had briefly found a way to make each other's strengths work. There is a detail that surfaces in accounts of the months following the split that feels worth holding on to. Jimi, by most descriptions, did not talk about the falling out in the terms that public narratives often apply to such moments, as liberation, as creative freedom finally achieved, as the removal of a constraint that had been limiting him. He talked about finishing the album. He talked about the next project, the studio he was planning to build, the sounds he was still trying to reach. He moved forward with the focused forward motion that defined his relationship to his own work. But people who knew him during this period have noted that he carried something quieter alongside that forward motion. A kind of awareness that the conditions that had made the first two albums possible were not replicable, that something had been used up in the process of making this third record. The studio Jimi had been planning was Electric Lady Studios, eventually built beneath the streets of Greenwich Village in New York City. He had conceived of it partly as a response to the exhausting and expensive conditions of working in commercial studios. The hourly rates, the scheduling, the sense of time always running out. His own studio would be available whenever he needed it, for as long as he needed it, configured exactly as he required. It was a visionary project and an extraordinarily expensive one. And the financial pressure it generated contributed to the relentless touring schedule that dominated the last 2 years of his life. But the impulse behind it was continuous with the impulse that had driven those late-night sessions, the search for conditions in which the music could find its own shape without the clock making every decision. Chandler went on to produce other artists, most notably Slade, whose run of United Kingdom hits in the early 1970s was built on precisely the direct, energetic, first-take immediacy that had always been Chandler's production philosophy. He was good at what he did. He knew what he was doing. He applied his approach to artists whose creative instincts aligned with it and found significant success. But in interviews conducted over the years, he would return occasionally to the subject of Jimi Hendrix with a mixture of pride and something more complicated. The pride of a man who had recognized something extraordinary before almost anyone else, and the more complicated emotion of someone who had been present at the moment when that thing began to move beyond what he could hold. The Electric Ladyland sessions, examined from a certain angle, look like a failure of communication between two people who had once been unusually well aligned. Examined from another angle, they look like an inevitability. The point at which Jimi's creative process had expanded to a scale that required conditions that no existing production relationship could quite contain. What he was building on that album was not just a collection of songs. He was developing a new way of thinking about what the studio was for, what recording was for, what the relationship between a musician and the technology of sound capture could be. That development required space and time, and the willingness to follow ideas past the point where the budget said to stop. By the time Electric Ladyland was released, it was already a controversial record. Too long, too sprawling, too much of everything by the standards of conventional album making. It was also, in the judgment of many who listened carefully, one of the most significant records made in that decade. The songs that Jimi had chased through dozens of takes, the sounds that he had spent entire nights trying to coax into existence, were on the tape. They were there. The album existed. And the cost of its existence was the end of the partnership that had made everything leading up to it possible. There is a quiet irony in the geography of what came next. Jimi built his studio. Electric Lady Studios opened in the summer of 1970, and Jimi recorded there for several weeks, working with the kind of sustained focus and freedom that he had always been chasing. The recordings from those sessions reveal an artist still moving forward, still searching, still finding new textures and new rhythms and new ways to make the guitar speak. Then, in September 1970, the search stopped. Chandler attended the funeral. He did not speak publicly about what he felt in the way that some others around Jimi did. He had been the man who brought Jimi to London, who fought for his first records, who believed before the evidence existed that this quiet young man from Seattle was going to change music permanently. He had been right, and the particular kind of rightness he had been, the practical, structural, protective kind, was exactly the kind that tends to disappear from the story once the legend becomes large enough to fill its own frame. What remains, and what the Electric Ladyland sessions make vivid when examined closely, is the picture of two genuine, creative intelligences pulling in directions that had once been the same direction and were now slightly, then significantly, then irreparably diverged. Neither man had changed exactly. Jimi had deepened. His process had expanded into territory that his earlier creative conditions could not contain. Chandler had stayed consistent with a philosophy that had been demonstrably right and continued to be right for the musicians whose instincts aligned with it. The gap between them was not a gap between art and commerce. It was a gap between two different understandings of where the music lived, whether it lived in the energy of the present moment, captured quickly before it could be thought to death, or whether it lived somewhere further in, accessible only through the kind of patient, obsessive excavation that respects no clock and no budget and no one's practical schedule. Jimi Hendrix believed the answer was both, and neither, and something else that he was still working toward in the last weeks of his life, alone in his studio on 8th Street, with the tape rolling the way it always rolled, is because you never knew when the right accident would happen. The argument that ended the partnership is remembered now as a dramatic moment, a clean break, a before and after. But the people who were in those rooms during that period have described something more gradual and more human. Two men who respected each other, who had built something real together, slowly discovering that they could no longer share the same space without the friction becoming larger than the music. The screaming match, if that is what it was not the cause of the split. It was the moment when what had already happened became impossible to pretend had not happened. And the album they were fighting over, Electric Ladyland, with its sprawling double-disc length and its dozens of overdubs and its sounds that should not have been possible to create with the technology available in 1968, went on to be heard by millions of people who knew nothing of the budget arguments or the late nights or the professional relationship that broke apart in its making. They heard only the music. They heard only the result of Jimi's refusal to stop before the song had found its form, which is, in the end, precisely what Jimi had been trying to protect all along. Not the process, not his right to run sessions past midnight, not his freedom to invite musicians in from the street, and he was protecting the music itself, the thing that lived inside the song and would only come out if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to keep the tape rolling until it appeared. He knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. The tape was always rolling. Wow.